So welcome everyone, attendees to the new season of AMAASE, Ask Me Anything About Social Enterprise. This is your opportunity to ask those burning questions that you have about social enterprise in general, whether they be brand new or experienced. My name is Christine Spottiswood. I normally fill my days as the project lead for UCeed, and today I'm honored to be standing in as temporary host for Alia, and will do my best this evening to fill her shoes. A quick note, today's session is recorded for those who might be unable to attend the live session, or those of you who want to go back and rewatch the invigorating discussion that we always have at these conversations. I will start by acknowledging that I am joining you today from my home in Devon, Alberta, on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Stoney Nakoda. I would like to acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. I do believe that a treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. I hope that recognizing our status as treaty people is one small action of many that will help us to be good neighbors to one another, good stewards of the land, and good ancestors to all our children. I welcome you to share in the chat more about the lands you are joining us from if you wish. I see we still have people joining us in a very steady flow, but I will, and we are excited to have you back for the fall season. A few housekeeping things, and I'll go over these at the end for those who are joining us a little bit later. AMAASE will now be hosted monthly, and starting in November, it will be held on the second Wednesday of the month, same time, 3:30 to 5 o'clock p.m. We will share those dates with you at the end. I think we have an image and the registration link in the chat as we work our way through. The sessions, however, will flow the same as they did last year, with our audience and attendees being the driver of the conversation and the discussion. So for those of you who have joined us, camera on or camera off, it doesn't matter. It is your time and your questions that we all came here for. So while I start our introductions, I will invite you to start getting your questions ready so we can make the most of our time together, and I will introduce our guests. So we'll start with Dan Overall, who comes from the Trico Foundation. I believe they'll get pinned. Jordana Armstrong from Innovate Calgary, and Jane Bisbee from the Social Enterprise Fund. And I'll change my view. All right, welcome, lovely panelists. We're excited to have you here again. And with that, I will invite the audience to share your question.
Okay, I'll start the party. Hi, everyone. Thanks for hosting this. Just wanted to ask the question to the panel about U of C is considering potentially exploring a certificate program in social innovation. Very early days, just some brainstorming and so on happening across a few faculties and with transdisciplinary graduate studies. I wondered if you could share your perspective on two things. What role does the university have in supporting knowledge development in our student population around social innovation? And then second, okay, I have three questions. Secondly, what do you see as core knowledge and competency areas around that? And then the third question is, how do we make sure we have good partnership between community social innovation leaders and academic faculties? So at the risk of overcomplicating the question, it's three parts.
Thanks, Allison. Jane, you look pensive. Do you want to get us started today?
I was going to say that the two capacity builders at the table should probably start, but all right, you put me on the spot, and so I'll make a couple of comments. I have found it more and more frustrating that we don't teach people generally in society how money works. I think it should start way earlier than university, and that we don't perhaps develop the core competencies around how to use money as a tool. So I spent a lot of my life explaining to my clients, people who want to have to borrow money, around how money works and how different kinds of lending and investment works. And so anything that would help that, I would think would be fabulous. And that it should be a basic how do you exist in society kind of need to have a better understanding about finance and how it works. So we were less afraid of it. We're too afraid of money, which makes me crazy. How to partnership? Yeah, we need to think about that and do it far more than we do at the moment. Some people say to me, how do you train a social entrepreneur? Well, you go and teach them everything they're learning up at the MBA school, and even earlier than that. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure the other two have lots to add or contradict.
Jordana, do you want to add to that?
I might just contradict the comment, Jane, around teaching them what we teach at the MBA school, because I think one of the challenges of not all MBA schools, but I think many focus on corporate, and sometimes developing an enterprise at the early stage is not always the same as running departments in corporations, but many MBA schools have caught on to that, and especially at UCalgary and Mount Royal here in Calgary, for example. I know that those folks do a great job of teaching entrepreneurship. I will say that for me, the role of a university is about knowledge creation and dissemination, whether that's dissemination through partnerships, whether that's dissemination through research, and or through the way that we educate young people or young folks who are attending universities. And so I think there's a really critical role. And Allison, just to take your question from social innovation and just add on that flavor of social entrepreneurship, because I would distinguish maybe between the two. I think in either case, the value of teaching these types of approaches in university is empowering folks to see a pathway for them to make change in their society in a pragmatic way. And so that to me is incredibly valuable, whether those folks go on to be social innovators, or they go on to be social entrepreneurs, or they work in organizations with this mindset of being able to change things around them and have some agency in that. So for me, that's where that role becomes really important. I think what's critical to teach, and I'm going to actually just make a comment and then maybe pass it off to Dan to dig into, but it's really about competencies and mindsets, I think. Systems, mindset, how do you think in systems? Like that's something that we're not seeing a lot of. I'll give you an example. I often like to ask social entrepreneurs, social innovators about who they work with. And sometimes you get really good answers. And sometimes, and what I mean by good answer is if you're trying to solve the issue of homelessness in Calgary alone, you're not going to do that exclusively through one product or service or the delivery of that. You have to be doing that in partnership with various levels of government, various types of partners. And so the more that we can teach folks to think in systems, I think is really critical. And again, those competencies, how do you work in a relational way? How can you be challenged and challenge other ideas? So, but again, we do teach these things in universities already. But for me, it's not sort of like functional areas that matter most. And in fact, the Trico Foundation does some really great work around mindsets. So maybe Dan, I'll pass it off to you again. And then the last thing about partnerships between academics and community organizations, I think what I am seeing is that there is a trend in that direction. But what we need to recognize is that the incentives, timelines, what value means, like how we define value across those types of stakeholders isn't always the same. And so just getting really clear on where there is alignment and where there isn't feels really important to me.
Well, for me, I think starters is what primarily social innovation and social entrepreneurship is fighting against, which is the profit maximization paradigm. Was launched from a university in Milton Friedman and the University of Chicago. So never underestimate the power of universities. to provide profound paradigm shifts for society. I see universities having, I think, three roles: teaching it, researching it, and then incubating it. And again, absolutely profound roles in all three. I agree with Jordana about the focus on mindsets and concepts, and we could probably talk about that all day. So I'll leave it there, but we can dig deeper in that, the mindset. In terms of partnerships, it's really not just a one-shot consultation, but really this deep relationship with your partners. So it's almost co-created. And if I may, jumping around, Roshni, and I hope I'm pronouncing your first name correct, has a question about working with MRU, which has a fantastic social innovation program. I'm a big believer in Matisse inspired Picasso and Picasso inspired Matisse. So if we could actually have our local post-secondary institutions, which are doing individually such great things, riffing off each other so they actually inspire and lift up each other, I think Alberta and Calgary, perhaps in particular, could have something really, really special.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Allison, did you have anything to add before we move on to the next question?
No, thanks for a great start to this discussion. And
Thank
good
you.
suggestions.
Thank you for your question. Nisa, I think you were next. I missed you at the beginning, didn't quite catch you. Do you want to share your question?
Yes, I have a question about my application for social impact fund. I'm working for Diameter. It is a startup that has an application for evaluating the posture, and we have a special app for evaluating the posture of workers when they are working or when they are affected by some work-related musculoskeletal disorder. And we are applying for this fund to improving our application. But my question is, can we apply this application on the staff of the University of Calgary? I mean that, can we consider the employees of the university as our target to implement our research? Because we believe that it has some extra benefit for the university when we are evaluating the efficiency of our application, and we use this grant for improving our application. At the same time, we are using this app for improving the posture of the member of the university. So it has extra benefit for the university, but I'm not sure that it's allowed to implement our research on this target or not. It's my question.
So I have a feeling that was quasi-directed to me. I'm going to take it to it like a general place, and then maybe Jane, if you have some things to add. So just one, really happy to follow up offline. So if you do have questions specific to the UCeed Social Impact Fund, you can always email uceedsocialimpact@innovatecalgary.com, and we will follow up with you to talk specifically about your application. Just for the purpose of today, to make it a little bit more general, one on supporting research commercialization that's really aligned to the fund. That's in fact, one of the core purposes of the fund is to support evidence-based solutions to societal problems. And so we really love when people leverage evidence, we require folks to leverage evidence, whether it's conducted within a university in a research context and or evidence that's been built in community through evaluation and learning. And so we want to see that there is some stickiness to the problem that you're solving. And then just to respond to the question, if I understood correctly, around sort of targeting UCalgary staff as a potential user of this technology. What I would say is to take a step back and really identify like who has the greatest pain, no pun intended. In fact, that pun was intended because it's just, but we talk about that. So when you're developing a solution, you really want to be thinking about who are you solving a problem for, and how much does that problem actually matter to them? So is it a nice to have? Are you kind of creating a gain in their life? Or is there kind of a significant pain and they're actually seeking out solutions to that problem? That's one thing to keep in mind. And I really don't encourage any entrepreneur to evolve their model to follow money. I would encourage you to evolve your model to be responsive to the market or the user that you're trying to solve the problem for. So you might be coming at it more from a market or impact perspective. And that's why I say kind of user or customer. They're not always the same thing, but ideally in an ideal world they are. So really, who's going to benefit from this, and whose pain are you taking away in the most like extreme kind of way? Because they're going to have the highest willingness to pay for this product. And then the other thing just to keep in mind is starting from a technological perspective is important, because you've got some substance there, but you don't want to underestimate the value of co-building or co-creating as you validate the product development. So there might be features that you build in for a particular user segment that you wouldn't build for another. And so really trying to refine who has this pain and who's willing to pay. And you can do that without a technology. You can do that through market research. You can do that through prototypes. But I would really encourage you to not necessarily target a particular audience because you think a funder would like it, but to really try to target an audience that actually has the pain, again, no pun intended.
Yeah, just to follow on to that, I think you'll find most investors don't have a preconception about who the customer is or who the stakeholder or beneficiary is, as much as Jordana says, who's really willing to try to solve that problem and put money on the table to solve that problem. And so I would rather see something that makes sense, that I can see that there's some evidence behind it, that you've done the research about what that marketplace actually is and connected those dots, because that's in the end what will make the operation successful. So I think the exercise that Jordana is talking about is one I often have to really encourage my clients or prospective clients to go through, because they haven't really thought that piece through. They're so excited about the good and the mission and the change they're going to make in the world, they kind of don't walk it back then and figure out, okay, but who's willing to pay for this? And this goes back to what I was mentioning earlier about, the teaching what is learned in the MBA schools. There's some of those exercises that new for-profit businesses are taught, and given those secret handshakes that I think would be well transferred over into civil society, into the kind of work that a lot of social entrepreneurs are trying to do. So it's very much forcing yourself into that sometimes grubby seeming exercise of figuring out, okay, who's paying, who's the actual customer market for this. And if you've nailed that properly, I think that an investor would come up and hug you, because that's something that's really important to be successful in what you're doing.
Jane, could I just, or Dan, may I just add an anecdote just to drive that point home? Because I think it's so valuable. So little teaser for next year's annual report. But one of the first companies we made an investment into, they've decided that they need to close up shop. And there's a lot of learning there around some of the tensions of like a scalable business model and trying to support people at the margins of society. Lots of interesting things to learn around public-private value and who pays, and a whole big op-ed and discussion maybe for another conversation when I can make that all public. But the entrepreneur made a really thoughtful reflection on what they did wrong. So there were definitely some pieces around willingness to pay within the demographic of folks that they were serving. In fact, it was really an ability to pay issue, but they also deeply reflected on, well, where did we actually go wrong? And he said, and this is someone who was involved with Skip the Dishes as it scaled globally. So good experience developing globally scalable technology. He said, we knew this, we knew this, we knew this. We knew not to obsess over the product. We knew to validate the market. And yet we still, if you look at our team, we were still deeply skewed toward product dev, and we didn't do enough validation of the market early enough. And so his point there was many entrepreneurs make this mistake. And so I think also as a team, holding yourselves really accountable to, are we really focused on validation, and are we being honest with ourselves about what the evidence is telling us? And I think one thing, to say it really simply, continue to fall in love with the why, not the what. And I think what happens is slowly the why, you slowly start to fall in love with the what, the product, how you're solving the solution, and you kind of forget that falling in love with the solution is how you're going to get there. And so if you as a team could challenge yourselves to keep really honest and authentic about that, like even serial entrepreneurs make this mistake. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it is a really important one.
And so do serial investors. Like I sometimes fall into that trap. I fall in love with the thing that looks like we're going to try to do through an investment, and really have to go back and then put my skeptic hat on. Okay, test your gut. Is anybody going to pay for this? And so that's it's something that both sides of the table, I think, have to take into account.
Thank you so much, Jane and Jordana. Dan, did you have anything to add before we move on? Awesome. Thank you so much, Nisa. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Thank you. I want to honor the chat questions as well as the hands up questions. So we're going to shift to Stephen really quick, and then Colton will bring your question forward. So Stephen had asked, I don't know if you're able to turn your camera on, Stephen, and elaborate. In the chat, he had asked, what is the best example of social entrepreneurship you have seen in 2022? Maybe I'll see if Dan wants to start us off. He's been a little quieter today.
Sure. So Jane mentioned today, she often does, the idea of if we could take what is taught in business school and provide it to social entrepreneurs, which is very key. But for Trico, we're particularly intrigued, in addition to that, what they don't teach you in business school, which is how you can actually combine the entrepreneurial and the social to have profound impact. And the favorite example that I've come across this year was something called SABKA, S-A-B-K-A, dentistry. And what they target is providing affordable dentistry in India. So if you think about it, if you want to provide affordable dentistry in India, what would you do? So they came across with this model where, and I'm sorry if there's like dogs barking in the background. First off, quite obviously, you would have as economically inexpensive a product as possible. So they have very small dental offices, 2 chairs max, and they have a rotation so they can do them quite effectively. And I think they do shifts with 2 dentists of about like 12 hours a day. So very inefficient, inexpensive, keep costs low. But in addition to that, what they've noticed is there's certain services such as fillings, which it can be either porcelain or metal. And the metal option costs more. And so for those that can actually afford the more costly one, that provides them a bit more profit. And then they use that profit to offset providing lower cost dental care to those who maybe can't afford it at all. The additional thing they do is they've looked at financing. So if you can't afford the dental care, they'll provide you financing so that you can. They've also really mastered the craft of providing affordable dental care in India. So they've now actually made that available to anybody else that wants to set up shop as an affordable dentist in India to kind of get the word out. And then finally, they realized that if they actually targeted preventative care, that's quite cheap and most people can afford it, so that you never get to the situation where you need the complex surgeries. And what I love about this, again, is these are techniques you could probably copy to deal with any clientele that doesn't have that much money. So it's about capturing those stories of social entrepreneurs who have techniques that then we can share to inspire others who are looking at doing similar things. So SABKA has actually been profoundly successful doing this. Prior to COVID, we don't have numbers post-COVID, but prior to COVID, they'd gone up to 112 clinics in India. And in 4 years, they'd gone from revenue of under 200,000 to over 8 million.
Thanks, Dan. Jane, do you want to share next?
No, I'm going to take a pass at this point. I love that one so much. I'm going to just leave it there.
Awesome. Jordana, do you have any examples of social entrepreneurship in 2022?
Yeah, I think we all have lots of examples. Another anecdote that came to mind, just because it drives the previous point home. Agree with Jane, the excellent share, Dan, and I really love that you kind of articulated those techniques that can be replicable. And this is a different example. It doesn't necessarily I won't delve into those techniques, but there's a company up in Edmonton that I just love. We recently invested in, and they're called Aredo Labs. So it's a women-led company. They're really a R&D shop, but what they've done really well is they have a number of different products. One of their products is a bot that analyzes sentiment on different types of socials, and then allows an organization, in their case, sports organizations or big media organizations, to be able to respond to negative sentiment for female folks in their communities. And that was product number 2. Product number 1 is an integration for online forms of communication like Slack and other MS Teams and things that folks would use within a company. And product number 2 allows organizations to understand marginalization and discrimination, and then in an anonymous and safe way, help that organization address it. Now, interestingly, product number 1 was the product that actually has the most amount of market traction. And product number 2 was something that the founder deeply, deeply loves and wants to go to market. It's where she sees the most impact. But listening to her story over the last year was one of the reasons we were really excited about the investment. She understood that to create sustainable impact, to continue to grow and hire her team, she really did have to start to think about how she was going to get revenue into the company and really focus on building a good, sustainable company. So, we're still early days, and early stage companies fail for all different types of reasons. But I think this is a really promising example of how an entrepreneur listened to their customer and sort of followed that trajectory where they could start to build a strong team, have good cash flow, get further investment to keep developing, and then they can move towards those products that they really love as they kind of build out that, as they substantiate and sort of build out their sustainability impact. So I think as social entrepreneurs, it's easy for us to really fall in love with the highest potential impact, and that's super important. And sometimes there is a pathway to sustainability in that. And again, her first product also has impact as well, but it's just not it's not her darling in the same way. And so just a story I like to share.
Thanks, Jordana.
Alberta based.
All right, hopefully that gave you some fresh ideas, Stephen. Colton, it's hard for me because when you sit there with your hand up, I have to remember you're not physically standing there with your hand up. So I appreciate the patience of both the chat questions and the live questions, but I welcome you to share your question with us.
Awesome, thanks everyone. Sorry, poor timing. You can probably hear my dogs in the background now too. Hopefully it's not too loud. Can you give me a thumbs up if it's okay? It's not drowning out. Okay, awesome. So my question's a little bit from the standpoint of not necessarily entrepreneurship, but someone who's a current employee, I guess. I'm not an actual entrepreneur, but I'd love to take my career into social enterprise, social innovation, social entrepreneurship. So my question, it kind of stems from, I think it was a previous AMAASE event that I had attended. And I remember one of the points that was driven home by a few of the social entrepreneurs on the panel was that while the social impact is, it's definitely a differentiation point. You still have to do what you're doing, your value you're delivering to your customers. You have to do that very well. So my question kind of tails onto a little bit of from an employment standpoint. So someone who's building out their career. If I'm hoping to shift into the social entrepreneurship scene or social enterprise scene, is it better to kind of focus on the skills I'm developing right now very well, or is there maybe perhaps something I should be looking to transition to that helps me be more, or I guess have a skill set that's tailored more to perhaps the unique needs of social enterprise, or is there a right way to go? So I'm just curious. I do have to jump off in a couple minutes here. So I don't know if anyone has any really quick pointers on that. Yeah, I'll leave it with that.
The answer to your or question is yes. And any skill set that you learn is going to be useful somewhere at some point. And I mean, I know that sounds like a flippant answer, but it's kind of really not. People say, how did you get involved in this world? Well, I'm a journalist by trade. I had no financial management training other than working in a magazine that had no money and having to figure out, okay, how do we survive? And learning how money worked was what became key. So you never know what the thing is that you learn that's going to be useful to go on. So the answer is yes. All of this, any possible skill could be used in the social enterprise context.
And I would actually double down on what Jane's saying and look at the other way and saying, I actually find the skills that are absolutely crucial for social innovation and social entrepreneurship are becoming the key skills in any company kind of worth its salt. So empathy, innovation, creativity, dealing with like limited resources. In fact, Clayton Christensen said, most of the profound innovations that are truly transformative as opposed to incremental come from dealing with difficult markets. So I would actually make the pitch, and I'm probably biased about this. If you master the key skills to social innovation, social entrepreneurship, they're probably like the gold key of whatever most companies are really going to require from their employees.
Jordana, do you have any last thoughts on that question?
I have nothing else to say. These two nailed it.
So thanks, Colton. I happen to have recently been told about a research study that very clearly articulated that it was actually in a study, those without formal training tended to be the more successful entrepreneurs, which I always think is really interesting. So glad we got your question in before you had to pop out.
Thanks, everyone.
We will move our way into the chat. I believe it's Yang Yang. I really hope I'm pronouncing, it's my one fault as a facilitator is I'm really bad with names. If you're able to turn your camera on and join us, we welcome you. If not, I'll read your question out. So he asks, what are some, or do you want to ask your question? Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Christine. Sorry, I kept my camera off because I'm having a terrible hair day today, but hi, everyone. Thank you for organizing this. The kind of premise for my question in terms of how do we measure impact is, I'll just use the example I'm currently in. So we're developing, our research currently is around developing a new mental health service resource. And we've got lovely funding to kind of run a pilot and to eventually evaluate it. But then the question that kind of keeps coming up and should be keeping coming up is the sustainability piece, is what happens after you're done the pilot and your research grants run out. How do you then, if we are developing a resource that we hope is useful, and as Jordana said, you know, it's taking away pains, very real pains for people, you know, in the community, how then do we, and a lot of these people who can't maybe actually pay for the resource, you know, how are we going to turn this research into an enterprise? And I keep thinking about, you know, revenue, and Jane, you said we're kind of scared of money. We kind of are all the time. We're like, ooh, you know, we were doing this out of the good of our heart, and as if then money pollutes that idea. It doesn't, but we don't have the business school training to kind of think about revenue, to kind of think about sustainability. And the only way I can kind of approach that in terms of how would we be able to convince investors is to talk about the impact that we can generate. And so the question then becomes, in addition to just saying, hey, look, this service, you know, has benefited X amount of people, how can we talk about impact in a way that would be convincing to basically get seed funding and to speak about that story to investors? I hope that makes sense.
And it's a big question. There's all kinds of pieces in that. Jordana talked about finding the person whose pain you're addressing. Yes, you have in your ultimate stakeholders, people are going to benefit from your work. You've mentioned you don't think they can pay for it. So this is an exercise then in discovering who wants what you are doing done. So who wants this fixed enough that they're going to invest, that they're going to pay for it as your customer. You have to do several kinds of exploration. So you need to discover who your customer is. And in my world, I think of that as who's the person that's actually paying for it. I have quite often have clients come to me that talk about who the ultimate beneficiaries are. And I keep saying, yeah, but are they paying you? Okay, so they're not your customer in the exercise that I try to take people through. It's, yes, they're very important. And yes, they may be measuring the impact of what you can do for them may well be the key to trigger your customers' interest in paying for it to happen, and also an investor's willingness to actually want to put money into it to make sure the business can grow, because those are two different audiences as well. And the investors, like in our case, the mission and the impact outcomes is the first thing that I want to talk about. I want to understand what it is, how deep it is, how complete it is in your company, and how you're measuring it and able to demonstrate it. Because if there isn't a certain level of impact, my investors aren't going to be interested, right? They're not going to want to put money into it. So it's very much an exercise in, you need to find sort of two levels of things, but you're absolutely understanding what a key is measuring that impact, because different customers and different investors will have different levels of need around how much impact they want to see. So it's kind of that you need to understand what it is that you're offering, the service that you're offering, and how to talk about that and how to measure and show that it's beneficial and that it changes lives. And then marry that with who the customer is that wants to pay for it, which may be government, right? And think about them as a customer in that case. And the investors the same way, because they have differing needs as well. Does that make sense? It's a very, you're asking a really big piece of, it's right questions, and we could talk about it for hours and do an analysis of what you're doing, but you're asking the right questions and you're thinking it through the right way.
Thanks, Jane. Dan, do you have anything to add?
Well, first, for the record, I'm having a bad hair day too, and I'm soldiering on, so just wanted to put that out there. I think the key is you need to figure out whether you have a business model, because if you don't have a business model and it's going to be grant-based, that's going to be a whole different type of funders. And you should have conversations that Jane alluded to up front. So if you're thinking you don't really have a business model here, i.e. something is generating revenue, and you're going more the grant donation route, it's having conversations with those funders and saying, like, what would you want to actually see from a project to actually fund it? Like, try to avoid guessing if you can. So again, that's upfront, again, getting their input as to what they would want to see. But step one is, I think you're going to need to figure out, grapple with whether in fact you have a business model or a market-based model, or you're not going to be able to generate funds from it. You're going to have to go more that kind of grant route, and then target your investors and have conversations with them from that point.
Thanks, Dan. And Jordana, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I would actually just echo that. Not only I think are you asking the right question, as Jane and Dan have said, but I also think you're asking it at a good time. I think often folks get to the end of their research and they think, okay, well, now what do we do? Especially when the research outcomes demonstrate positive outcomes or are substantiated. And so starting to think about this early, like who could benefit, how would this be sustainable is I think very valuable at an earlier stage. And just because if it turns out not to be a social venture, I don't think that's, I think that it's good to learn that early on. But I just want to kind of reframe what kind of Jane and Dan have already touched upon. The validation, so the qualitative understanding of the impact to the user or the beneficiary matters. And then the qualitative impact to like why the customer cares. If you can start to understand that story of why the customer cares alongside producing the research outcomes, then when you go to speak to even grantors who are in the kind of more commercialization space, you're going to be able to tell this story of validation, and the way that you present the data and sort of the types of conversations you might be asking are maybe slightly different than what you need to ask to get the research outcomes that you're looking for. But if you can double down on that a little bit and start to sort of build in some of that thinking early, which it sounds like you're doing, I think that that's invaluable. So, you can do a lot of research around, concepts of validation. There's some really nice, I'll drop a link in the chat, but there's a few kind of different books on like, what do we mean when we say validation in the entrepreneurship context? And it's quite different than what we mean in the research context. But if you can, layer in a few additional questions, as Jane and Dan said, to get at that customer, I think that's really valuable. Also, just to plug, as it sounds like you're at UCalgary, there is a program called Evolve to Innovate that is specifically designed for this kind of stage. And it sounds like you know what that is, but I'll still drop the link in the chat just for folks who aren't familiar.
So Jordana, I'm having my interview with Evolve to Innovate tomorrow morning.
Oh, good.
So I'm glad to kind of get some nuggets here as well. Thank you again, all of you. We did obviously also think about kind of what the impacts are, but it's interesting to think potentially government as a customer, for instance, right? Because the way that we were formulating our impact is if we are able to implement a community-based mental health resource, it would save the health system money over time. And we'd kind of look at the health economics perspective of things to say, well, you're saving this much money by reducing the number of inpatient and ER, admittance and so on. But it's good to kind of think more broadly, because we all know that not everything kind of works out all the time whenever we pitch to government, and it's such a giant system. So if we can't wait on that and we still want to implement this resource, what are the other routes that we can explore? I also saw some people message in response in the chat, and so thank you for those pieces. I'm going to follow up with that as well. Thank you.
I also noticed the 8-bit cortex in the chat, and if you haven't, Dr. Richard Ramsey is also on the call, who has some experience in a parallel space and would be a good person to reach out to as well.
I'm going to add one small word of caution. I'm glad you are thinking about this early on, and be ready to not fall in love with any one particular solution, because I've seen some people go a long way down a pathway because they just think that this is an aspect of what they're planning to do that has to happen in this way. And it can come back to bite you. So as Jordana was saying, think it all through and be ready to upend some of your own assumptions if that becomes necessary.
Great. Thank you so much for your question, and to our panelists for their thoughtful responses. I will open the floor to MGE, initials make it very easy to pronounce, was the next question in the chat. If you're able to turn your camera on or unmute and ask your question, I will welcome you to do that. If not, I will read it out. So how can we encourage and emphasize the need for inclusion of people with disabilities through all university students, from the entrepreneurial program and other fields to new and all entrepreneurs? Why government incentives and subsidies and the suggestion of a specific quota from the businesses are not in effect more promoted, I think, or podcast. So I will let you mull on that question for a minute, because it took me 3 reads to be able to read it out loud. And does anyone want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, there's some pieces in there. Well, the question's being reframed, maybe just like generally around some thoughts on inclusion, and in particular folks with disabilities. So we're in this process right now. We're about to launch a physical space for the on campus that will support social innovators, called the Social Innovation Hub. Really excited to welcome some of you folks and all of you folks into that space. We worked with Included by Design, which is also an investee of the fund, to do an accessibility report. yay, social procurement. And we're really excited to get the findings back, thinking about ways that we could be more inclusive in our physical space. And I think what I'm thinking about is that intentionality matters, action matters, and it has this work has to be put at the front and center, and it has to be valued as important from leadership, top down, and from folks in organizations demanding this. So we were a little late to the game and didn't get that inclusion report in. So we're working through renovations and trying to figure out ways to bring in additional dollars to make some of these recommendations happen. And it's sort of, there's an intentionality there, but that's why I said action matters. And so, yeah, I think the reflection I have just in our own experience is, unless we're taking it seriously and unless we are kind of putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak, it's not happening in a more substantive way. So MG, I'm just thinking out loud with my own experience as you reformulated your question so that we might be able to address it head on. But I think, I know I have one of my peers on the call, one of my colleagues from Innovate Calgary, and we were just talking last week about this idea of representation and just making sure that we have appropriate representation for the communities that we're trying to create. And it's not just about inviting diverse folks to the table, whatever that diversity looks like, but it's also making sure that when we bring folks to the table, that the seating is appropriate, that we're serving folks the right meals. And so, yeah, really trying to think that through in our own work, not doing it perfectly. Actually, would like to be doing it a lot better, and would welcome feedback from folks on the rest of the call. But what I would just say in summary is that, we can put responsibility on government, we can put responsibility on other folks, but I think we also have to take responsibility in our own organizations as leaders, as folks working in organizations, to advocate for that kind of representation that we want to see.
Yeah, I agree absolutely, and also to be intentional about the work that we're doing, which is one of the reasons why we invested in Included by Design too, is because of the work that they're doing. They're going to be able to help solve things that I can't directly, or even to help us understand what some of those questions are from their point of view. So yeah, that's all I have to add at this point.
All right, looks like we might be hitting the point that was intended. Dan, did you have anything to add? Hey, thank you, and thank you for the question. Just scrolling through the chat here. Anka, I think. I have your question there in the chat. And if you are able to unmute and ask your question, I see statements, but I'm just not 100% sure what your question is around. I'm happy to read it out. But if you are able to add to that.
I can chat and ask. So my name is Anka. Thank you guys for this. We're building our app as a social enterprise, and we are focusing on mental health of the single parent. I have first-hand experience as a single parent. And my question would be, what would your advice be? I need to look at grants. I need to look at who I can connect with. As an alumni at UFC, I feel that there's a lot of opportunity for people that are currently attending, but it's tough to get back into gathering information on building and receiving supports as an alumni. So that would be my first question. And it's around grants, really. We need to go live. This has taken way longer than it should have been in what we're building. We've done client discovery. I've been at several accelerators throughout the city. Our goal is to build internationally in 5 years. And so we're not even live yet. And I just want to connect with the right people to see how we can build and grow quicker. So grants, any advice you can have as a social enterprise app. Thank you.
This is probably in Jordana's wheelhouse, but I'm going to say something that I alluded to earlier, which is, yeah, grants might be good, but they might be more trouble to you than they're worth. There might be other mechanisms. Some people spend so much time looking for grants, they never actually get around to running their business. So cautionary tale about that. But Jordana, Dan, you might have some helpful thoughts about this too.
Do you want to go first, Jordana, or shall I? Grants is always interesting, depending on what legal structure you have picked. I'm sensing you've picked for-profit as your legal.
We're for-profit, social enterprise, and we're incorporated, correct? And we're going to add a foundation arm, but that's later.
Okay. The for-profit choice. So this is not advice in terms of your legal status and choices. It's just talking about ramifications. So given the area that you're focusing on, given the fact that you're for-profit, now a lot of foundations aren't going to be able to provide grants to you because of CRA requirements. So you're probably looking mostly at governments and any type of other programs that you mentioned through university, and I don't know how many of those are available. So it's always tough with the grant funding. Now, what's interesting is, and this may be getting way too much detail and it may take longer than will actually help you, but the federal government has actually lifted some of the restrictions on foundations so they actually can provide grants. I can't tell from the legislation whether it's restricted to not-for-profits or whether it could include for-profits that have a social purpose. My guess is it might just still be continually restricted to not-for-profits. So yeah, going after grants when you're a for-profit can be pretty tough. But again, I sense that Jordana may have some more knowledge and experience on the for-profit side of things than me.
Yeah, I think Dan's right about you're really looking at government and you're really looking at a kind of commercialization supports because you're a technology, rightly or wrongly, I'm biased, I think wrongly. We put more emphasis on tech-based innovation, whether it's social impact or not, even though some of the largest transformational businesses don't necessarily have a strong tech foundation. Nowadays, everything's tech enabled, of course, like, we're all sitting on technology right now is what I mean by that. But in any case, Alberta Innovates is a funder in Alberta that looks at like tech development. They have various levels of grants, so smaller grants for sort of early product development. NSERC IRAP is another good one. NSERC IRAP, those types of funding programs allow you to bring on technology partners to develop. MyTax is another good one that allows you to work with university partners. And so you could explore those as first opportunities. Definitely connect with someone. There is also a program, I was going to drop the links, that's why I'm looking over here. There is a Government of Canada program called the Concierge, and the Concierge program just helps people navigate what federal funding programs are available. Now, just going back to this, like a frustrating conversation that we keep having around validation, but those grantors are going to ask you about validation. So you're going to need to be able to tell that same story. So to kind of a point that Jane has made before, sometimes chasing grants, and I'm not saying that's what you're doing, Anka, I'm just kind of generalizing, but chasing grants rather than focusing on validating and building your business isn't going to serve you when you're looking for these types of grants, because they're going to be asking the same types of questions that investors are going to ask. So, who's your customer? Who's your market? Demonstrate willingness to pay, ability to pay. Who are your competitors? How are you different? A question that we would ask as social investors is, who are your co-operators? How are you thinking about systems and how are you thinking about shifting systems? I don't always love the idea of competition, but when you have an enterprise, you do have to have some sort of differentiation because you want folks to pay for what you're doing. And then the bottom link that I'm about to drop, if you're a little bit earlier than applying, and I couldn't tell from your description the exact stage that you're at, if you're maybe not ready, you don't have all of that validation yet. And there's a really neat program, formerly the Social Innovation Academy, now called Propel Impact. They have these student opportunities with like really well-trained, very smart students in the social enterprise and social finance space that will work with enterprises in early stage to help undertake a time-bound project. So that might be, specific market research. That might be, I don't know, defining and implementing a pilot. That might be, that could be doing a search of particular grants that could be available to you. So just a little plug for Propel Impact, which is now it's a merger of the Social Innovation Academy and the National Social Value Fund coming together, which is exciting. And then that just made me think another really great program to bring on someone, to bring on a youth into the company. Again, this person could be hired as a product manager. This person could be hired in marketing. They could be any different kind of space that you need. Venture for Canada is another federal funding program that allows you to bring on that talent that you might need to continue to validate and build your business, because that's one of those challenges of an early stage business, is if you're doing everything, you're doing everything. But on that, just a little plug, one of my favorite entrepreneur coaches, a gentleman called Scott Picard, said a long time ago, one of the most important things an entrepreneur can discern is what rises to the top of their to-do list. And I know that's very much what the CDL venture coaching model is based on. So yeah, just a little plug of, I know that there's a lot going on when we're early stage, but also narrowing down that discernment of what the next step is really important.
And I think Platform Calgary, as well as Innovate Alberta, might be able to assist you in directing you to resources.
Absolutely.
And another great kind of referral point is actually peers. So if you know anybody who's going through a similar tech journey to you, always talking to them as to what they're finding out about the ecosystem and who's responsive might be useful as well.
And Aga, that Propel Impact is just that, it was formerly called the Social Innovation Academy, and it's just a time-bound project. So students will come in and do a project with you if there's interest there.
Great, thank you, panelists. Did you have any closing thoughts?
Sorry, no, Jordana, what was it? Was that Propel the one in Edmonton, or is that?
It's national.
Social innovation, what was it?
They're
called?
all, I dropped them all in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, guys.
And I'll do my own little plug for NMAADA, just because I can and I hold the mic. So at UCeed and with many of the people sitting on this panel, we've been working on our own resource navigation tool called NMAADA, which, if you are interested, there is a demo happening as part of Innovate Calgary's Innovation Week. I will drop a link at the chat at the end of the session. That is will be there to help answer those kinds of questions, which is what kind of funding might be available in the ecosystem based on your corporate structure, your demographic, and some of those. I'm having a hard time switching from facilitator mode to like talking mode. That's weird how that works. Anyway, I do welcome you to check it out. It did just launch, so the list of resources is fairly small at the moment. We're waiting for approvals from a few still. We have over 100 sitting in the queue waiting for organizational approval, and there's my dogs. So I welcome you to check back in another couple weeks, and I think you'll see it. The profiles are a lot more robust than they are at the current moment. But welcome. Jordana actually made note of all of those to make sure that they either are in the queue or will be added into the queue, so that those resources are easy for social entrepreneurs to find. And Shannon, are you able and or willing to turn on your mic or video to ask your question?
Hi, everyone. So my question is about the upcoming recession that we keep hearing about, and I'm wondering if you're thinking, is it a good time to start a social enterprise, or are you seeing less people interested? I know that when we started APIC Cortex, it was in the midst of the pandemic, and for us there was a lot of opportunities in the, kind of the turmoil at the time, but I'm wondering what you're seeing on your side.
It always comes down to opportunity, and is there an opportunity there? Recession can be a perfect opportunity for certain kinds of enterprises. So it really depends on what you're doing. The encouraging thing that I saw about the pandemic, for example, is that our work didn't slow down. There were people who saw doors opening because of the pandemic and decided to, stick their foot through them and explore where that would go. So yes, it gives a point of caution because people will think about how they're spending money and do they have money and what will they spend it on. But there's certain activities of life that just keep going on. So it really comes down to being honest with yourself about where your business works and who your customers are, and do they want what you are offering enough to actually put their money down and pay for it. So I think it's a time for caution, but I also think times of plenty are a time for caution too, because if you set up a business based on the idea that everybody's got money, it could come back to bite you. So you might, if you can build a recession-proof business, you might be in a better place, but it really comes down to what that is.
Thank you. That was super helpful.
I would just follow that on with a quote that I heard from Tim Draymond, formerly with the McConnell Foundation. I think he's still on the board. Never let a crisis go to waste.
Yeah, I used to have a list of all the extraordinary companies that were actually started in a recession. There's tons of them. But to just add on the great points that have already been made, and also bear in mind, it's not only do you do it, but how you do it. So there's principles such as affordable loss. What are you willing to kind of lose as opposed to gain, and all these techniques so that you could proceed cautiously and reasonably, whether it's recession or not. So keep those in mind as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Shannon, and to the panelists for all their answers. Kathy has snuck a question in right before I was about to close it. Thank you for that, Kathy. Are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, yes. Hi. Thank you all. This is really a great session. Really appreciate it. My question is about what possibilities could there be for enterprises that bring together different generations, like baby boomers with millennials, together in the blockchain and the NFT digital worlds? And is there any support in accessing and building those new audiences cross-generational?
Like any kind of specialized grant program, it comes down to, well, who's interested in having that done? You know, it's a matter of, I mean, I don't know what business idea you might be thinking of. That's your description was a little high level for me to understand what it is that you're looking for, but it goes back to who wants the problem that you see solved.
Right, right. And there's two problems there. There's the problem of accessing a new realm of possibility, and then there's the problem of generations working together so that the wisdom of the boomers doesn't disappear, and the brilliance of the millennials can sort of fit in with that.
I didn't know about the blockchain and NFT worlds, but certainly we're seeing a number of enterprises come up that are trying to bring the generations together. So that does seem to be something that a lot of social entrepreneurs are picking up on.
Do you think it's worth spending time on if one has a business idea in that area?
I think that would be your answer. And again, depending on the techniques that you go for exploring that, right? But it could be literally the $1 million question.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
I would just add, Kathy, because you mentioned audiences, I think it's also important to recognize both the similarities and differences in generations in terms of how they access information. And so I would encourage you, if you're thinking about a multi-generational target audience, and again, I'm just paraphrasing, to make sure that you have those perspectives on your team so that you know what channels and where to reach the types of folks that you're looking to reach. I'm often surprised that folks like six years younger than me are starting to do things, especially online, that you're starting to pick up on different social channels that like I didn't even know existed. So I think it's important, if you're targeting a multi-generational audience, to make sure that you have that perspective, whether it's through an advisory board or it's through your team in terms of that diversity. But all too often I'm seeing teams that don't represent that generational diversity. So, you know, we have a number of innovations where we have youth solving problems for youth, and I think that's great. And, you know, it's more commonplace to see youth seek out elder advisory, but it's less commonplace in my experience, just with the companies we've looked at, to see you know, bringing in the generational perspectives in terms of designing products and services, even when they're trying to target that audience. So mental health has come up a lot on this call, but I have a lot of folks, and this is kind of talking to all of the, you know, I have a lot of folks who are far removed from the generations that are trying to solve mental health problems for youth. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I think that there's a real application of science and knowledge to support youth mental health outcomes, but there's also a perspective of like, how are you reaching that audience? How are you talking to them? If that is, say, your target customer. And so that's just one thing I wanted to say. And then the second is, on blockchain and NFTs, like my personal perspective is that I don't think these things are going away. I don't see them as trends. I think I see them as transformational. And there was a really neat blockchain project that was presented at a conference a couple of years ago, not commercially viable yet, but they were using blockchain to raise public infrastructure dollars. And the example that they modeled it on was the High Line in New York. So rather than public dollars going into the funds that they needed to raise to build the High Line, raising funds via blockchain from communities surrounding the High Line to then share in the value increase that would happen as a result of the High Line being built. And so I think there are really neat social innovation projects out in the world that are leveraging blockchain. And there are a lot of folks that have way deeper expertise than I. And in fact, you probably are connected, but there's a few blockchain communities in Alberta that have sort of popped up. So maybe just spend some time on LinkedIn and Eventbrite and sort of check out some of those communities if that's a space you're interested in.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much.
I will take this lull in the conversation to begin our closing and our wrap up. First, thank you all participants and panelists for attending and participating today. It would suck to sit here for an hour and a half in complete silence, and I have thoroughly enjoyed all of the questions and all of the dynamic conversation that has come out of it. As host, as well as in our panelist, I learned more by attending than any expertise I could ever bring to the table. So humbly appreciate all of your contributions and those who contributed in the chat as well. We've been doing this for a while now, and they continue to be so invigorating and so exciting, and the questions the same yet diverse, that I am excited that we will keep doing this every month for the next, I think, the calendar. Omar, do you have your graphic ready to go? Maybe we'll start with that, with the very long list of scheduled dates. So you guys can come up with as many questions as you want, and we will have time to answer them all, as our schedule currently goes to December of 2023. As we do close, I would like to provide an opportunity for the panelists to share any updates from their organizations, as well as their closing thoughts on how they're leaving today's session. As attendees, if you have anything you do want to share, I do welcome you to pop it in the chat as well. I did receive one private message from an attendee who had to leave, I believe. So I'm just going to pop that in the chat because she asked me to share it when the time is right. And so we will start with that. So Jane, welcome your upcoming excitement and your closing thoughts on today.
This is an alert for some people who've been waiting, and those of you who haven't been waiting, for the investment readiness program, the second round of the government of Canada's cash to go to social purpose organizations that want to get themselves ready to be able to approach social finance intermediaries for investment, has opened very, very quietly. The portal opened a week and a half ago. It will close for applications on the 22nd of November. And the delivery of the program in Alberta this time round is going to be handled by the Red Deer Community Foundation and the Banff Canmore Community Foundations. So for more information, you can email irpalberta at, I'm going to take the glasses off to read this, rddcf.ca. And the phone line is 1-587-457-6353. You should probably be able to find some stuff online, but some of the promotion material is still being worked on because it kind of snuck up on everybody quietly. And we'll try to circulate that as it becomes available. But now you at least know it's there and it's open for the next 5 weeks.
And any closing thoughts, Jane? Thank you for that.
No, but thank you always. This is always interesting. It always gets my brain working, and I love hearing about what people are concerned with. It's intriguing how it's different every time.
Thanks, Jane. Dan.
I think right now we just have internal stuff we're kind of grinding through in terms of projects, nothing kind of public facing. And just as always, so grateful for the people that make their time to come and ask questions. So thank you for being part of AMAASE and asking your questions.
Thanks, Dan. Jordana.
Just for folks who are thinking about applying to UCeed Social Impact, for this round, our applications close this week. Just a reminder, we are always open for applications, but we do have board meetings 4 times a year. So this is the cutoff for the next board meeting. Jane is also always sourcing deals full year round. So approach either of us at either time, at any time. And also just wanted to plug this AMAASE series was a part of something called Social Innovation Week at U Calgary. And so folks who didn't hear about AMAASE through that, we just welcome you to check out some of the other events that are happening. And that's all for me.
Thanks, Jordana. I will follow up that with a reminder that for those interested in learning more about NMATA, which is that resource navigation tool, we are doing a demo as part of Innovation Week presentation and demo tomorrow morning. And I believe registration is open until 10:30. So you are welcome to still register. Ritwick will throw some links in the chat. As well, if you're interested in a bit more of a curious conversation, we are relaunching our Friday morning conversations for those who have attended. This was formerly called Engaging the Ecosystem and is now called Curious Conversations. The registration link for that, we will host these every other week on Friday morning. And these are just social innovation, social entrepreneurship, broad ecosystem conversations to get the hamster wheels turning. And with that, I thank you all for coming. I will give you the gift of time for 13 minutes and wish you all a lovely Tuesday after a long weekend and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.